So here in Sacramento, as you know, we have the worst heart attack and stroke rates of any metropolitan area in California. So we need everyone to be thinking about what can we collectively do to turn the tide for these patients. And I will let our wonderful speaker, my dear colleague, Bob Kaplan, talk about that in more detail. Dr. Kaplan is quite the world traveler, and he will be formally introduced by our chairman in a moment. But in my world, he has made such a difference by really applying his considerable gray matter to systematic thinking about how do we bring down heart attacks and strokes. How do we better apply the science and the knowledge that we have? And that's something each of us needs to do collectively, and I appreciate all of you being here. So with that, I want to say how much I appreciate my co-chairs, Dr. Bill Baumer, who's trained more cardiology residents in Sacramento than probably anyone in history, and Dr. Matt Wanacott, who's come a very long distance to help us co-chair this meeting. So thank you all for overcoming obstacles to be here. Bill, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted today, but conflicted in introducing our next speaker. Conflicted because you may realize that UC Davis, for the first time, got into the women's NCAA pick for March Madness this year, and literally was taken out of it by a institution called Stanford, which so there are conflicts here as we speak. March Madness did finalize for the women, and they won last night, and the men will be playing tonight. So it will be we'll see who wins on the men's side. But I'm here with now on the other side to introduce Dr. Kaplan. And it would be very difficult to read everything that I have here on Dr. Kaplan. But I'll summarize a few things. Chief Science Officer and Associate Director of the NIH, a very important position. For that, he has been affiliated with UCLA, where he is currently Emeritus Professor and was instrumental in the RAND UCLA relationship for that. He did also practice at the University of California, San Diego, so he's been involved with that. He has 20 books and 500 articles, and I will not read each of those right now for this introduction. He is currently, as I said, adjunct professor at Stanford at this time. He has an enormous amount of publications, accomplishments, and everything else, and an outstanding career, and he has been part of the RightCare initiative. And the reason I mention that is he was actually principal investigator of the NIH grant that started the RightCare initiative, University Best Practices, for which we are all gathered here today. So he is literally responsible for us being here today. So with that, I would like to introduce our father, who are in Stanford, Robert Kaplan.
So the wonderful thing about Bob Kaplan is he's so understated. So when the the dean of UCLA School of Public Health said, "I'd like Bob Kaplan to start helping you with this project." I went to meet with Bob, and he started, very quietly participating on our weekly calls that have frankly been going on since 2007. And without saying a word, he just put in a grant to the National Institutes of Health, which is what brought us into the community setting to try to implement the things on the RightCare triangle that you see on your project brief and also there by the screen. So Bob, thank you for your quiet, amazing wisdom that got us to start working to bring people together around the cause of implementing the best practices.
So what do you say after two nice introductions like that? I wasn't expecting that. It wasn't that simple. But as you'll see, that Dr. Bomber and others, I'm not quite the father, but I appreciate the appreciate the confidence. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some things that I've been talking with Hattie about for years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about managing cardiovascular risk factors, but also about these related issues of, is this enough? Do we need to go further? But before I do that, people kind of just said, was the father of this effort actually didn't go in for a while, as you know. There have been other influences, fairly important ones. So Hattie has been working on this for much longer than anybody else, but also with a great deal more energy and enthusiasm than anybody could imagine. So thank you, Hattie. That I've had a relatively small role, but I'm happy to take credit for it because it's gone so well. So thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about risk factors, their management, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about where we go from there. So to begin, disclosures, I am employed by Stanford University, as Dr. Bomber mentioned. I'm retired from the University of California system. I spent years at UC San Diego and UCLA. I'm also retired from the federal government, where I work both at the National Institutes of Health and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And I am a consultant to Purdue University, and I am a small-time consultant. So I don't think any of that relates directly to what I'm going to say today. One of the things I found very interesting recently is that the American Heart Association has recently revised their mission statement. And it goes something like this. The American Heart Association has as its new mission to be a relentless force for a world of longer, healthier lives. And the interesting part of this revision of the mission statement is it doesn't mention heart disease. That, in fact, the world seems to be shifting where what we're attempting to do is to get people to live longer, healthier, and better lives. And reducing deaths from heart disease and disability from heart disease is a major factor of that. But the Heart Association wants to go bigger. So you don't see as much of this as you did a few years ago. And but I'm going to sort of get into that in a while. I think all of you in this audience are aware that there's been a precipitous decline in deaths from all cardiovascular diseases going back to at least the late 1960s. And that this trend has been quite impressive. And we'll come back and talk a little bit about the forces that have driven that. But I want to take a couple minutes to present some of the data that Hattie's given to me about cardiovascular mortality rates in your area, the capital area, and what some other areas in California. And we can talk about these data for the rest of the time. I'm going to blow by this, but I'd like you to just think about this, because hopefully we'll be able to come back and spend a fair amount of time in the discussion section with this. But what the data show is that deaths from cardiovascular disease, stroke, and diabetes are higher in the capital area than they are in many of the other areas in California. Hattie mentioned that in her introduction. Hospitalization, same story, that you have higher rates for MI and higher rates for stroke in this area than the state in general. Similarly, MI, the number of MIs or hospitalizations for MI are higher in Sacramento than they are in the state, for both males and females. MI hospitalizations by race, and there is a race differential throughout the state, but it's actually fairly pronounced in Sacramento in relation to other communities, something we can come back to in a while. If we look at strokes by race, actually not as much of a disparity for black versus white, but still across the spectrum, higher rates in Sacramento than in other areas of California. If we look at self-reported risk factors, self-reported hypertension, this comes from the California Health and Beauty Survey. Self-reported hypertension, obesity, smoking rates actually about 3% different, 2.5% different in Sacramento in relation to the rest of the state. Diabetes, heart disease, and heart failure, all a tiny bit higher, but higher in Sacramento than elsewhere in the state. And then Hattie also gave me the data that looks at performance, is meeting these targets that have been set for the Right Care initiative in Sacramento versus the rest of California. So the good news is that for some of these have improved in 2017 in relation to 16 and 15, but not for all of them. And so the yellow bars are 2017, you can sort of look at the trends. So for some of them, for Sutter, for example, and Sutter Independent, things have been getting better over the last few years. But that's not so for all groups. In fact, in some of the groups, things are getting actually somewhat worse rather than better. Anyway, that was for controlling blood pressure. Blood pressure is defined as getting down below 140 millimeters of mercury systolic and 90 diastolic. Come back to those definitions in just a bit. Similarly, for controlling blood pressure for people with diabetes, if you look at the overall target of 76%, there's a tendency to fall below that for most of the medical groups. So there is room for improvement and room to grow. These are the data for controlling blood pressure, blood sugar, getting below, glycosylated hemoglobin is 8% for people with diabetes. And again, some improvement in some groups, and some groups are going beyond the target, but some groups are not. Just to give you a sense of these comparisons with other counties, so these are the Sacramento medical groups who are prescribing statins to people who have heart disease. And by the way, we come back to this idea of statins for everybody or statins for people in select groups like people with heart disease and diabetes. But if you look at the target of 87% in the Sacramento area, a couple of groups are meeting it, Kaiser South Sacramento and Dignity, but most of the other groups still are a little bit below, and in some cases a fair amount below. If you look at this for statin prescriptions for people with heart disease, that still a couple groups are meeting the standard, and this is, Santa Clara County. And a couple of groups are not. It's about 50% meeting the standard in Santa Clara County. If you look at Los Angeles County, it's sort of up and down a little bit. Relatively good performance by some groups, but still most of them need to come up some to meet the standard. This one is prescribing statins to people with diabetes. This is in Sacramento County. Just 3 of the groups that are meeting the standard, and then a number of other groups needing to come up some to meet that standard. If you look at this in Santa Clara County, still a fair number of groups not meeting the standard, but about half of them do. And in Los Angeles County, again, up and down a little bit. So again, we can come back to discuss this and how there is room to grow. But what I'd like to do is, I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking a little bit about strategies for reducing the burden of cardiovascular disease and how this fits into this global pattern. And I owe this to Hattie, that Hattie, when she was in San Diego, started this idea that what we should be thinking about is we should be thinking about something that Brown and Goldstein mentioned actually when they won the Nobel Prize for their contributions to lipid and lipid metabolism many, many years ago, 1996. And they suggested that that heart attacks actually should be gone with the 20th century. In other words, we should be able to get close to zero by doing better management a better job of managing cardiovascular risk factors. And so I'm going to come back to that theme because I think it's a worthy goal, but also something that might be very difficult to achieve. So, what are the strategies that we might use to try to get towards zero? So, I'm going to mention 3 strategies, and the first strategy is one that comes from the RightCare initiative. I think many of you are familiar with this, but the idea is that the strategy is based on the idea that we can do much better by pulling provider groups together, having them come together around what we already know is beneficial, and then applying that in the community, organizing groups, coming together. I think Patty mentioned this before, that many years ago when I was at UCLA before I went to government, Gavin and I and a couple others went around San Diego County banging on doors at groups and talking to them about how they might use whatever we know about managing cardiovascular risk factors to improve the health status of communities. And this related to something I worked on a little bit in government when I was at AHRQ. As Chief Science Officer at AHRQ, one of the interesting parts of that was that HRQ, among other things, runs the United States Preventive Services Task Force, which is something that was really fun to work with. But in addition to that, they had a lot of these efforts on dissemination and implementation science. So for example, one of the things that we work very hard on is reducing deaths from hospital-acquired infections. By the way, when RightCare started, that it had 2 objectives. It was designed to work on reducing deaths from cardiovascular disease and stroke. But it had a second wing to it, which was reducing hospital-acquired infections. And unfortunately, we got so busy with cardiovascular risk factors that we haven't pursued the second piece of it. But we did at HRQ. And what this involved was just doing fairly simple things. It's going around to other groups and hospitals, trying to figure out which ones were doing the very best job, using what we call positive deviants, that is, the groups that were performing much better than the others, and then trying to teach other groups to do what the best performing groups were doing. And as a result of that, by very conservative estimates, it was estimated that we saved about 1.3 million lives through relatively simple interventions, hand-washing interventions, unrecruited things that are done in hospitals to reduce hospital-acquired infections. They estimated it was about 50,000 lives, and actually now, it's 1.3 million fewer patients' arms. It was estimated that it was about 50,000 lives saved. Now the estimate is up over 100,000, and that hospital-acquired infections reduced by about 17% in those hospitals that were part of our intervention program in comparison to control hospitals. So the same principle was applied in the RightCare initiative. This slide, I think many of you have seen, that if you're RightCare aficionados, but what happened in San Diego County was that we had worked with medical groups, gone out, we tried to identify the best performers, and then teach the other groups to do what the best performing groups were doing. And then we followed outcomes over the course of years between 2007 and 2016. And this slide comes from a paper that was published in Health Affairs in September. So as you can see, that this is a comparison between San Diego, the blue line, and then the rest of California, which is the orange line. So by the way, BTSD is called Be There San Diego, which is the name that Patty might have to explain how we drifted to that name. That was.
It was Jack and Judy White who gave us a grant to create a public education campaign, and that public education campaign slogan was Be There San Diego, and it's about being there for your family members and motivating family members by saying, do you want to be there to dance with your daughter at her wedding? Do you want to be there to blow out the candles for your daughter's birthday, that kind of thing. So that's where...
By the way, and it was enhanced by Rolf Benirschke, who was the place kicker for the San Diego Chargers. And he's an icon in the community. His father was a very well-known academic physician at UCSD. And I think Rolf had some organization that I think had coined the term Be There San Diego, but...
it was actually Jack White that coined the term. And Rolf kind of, with his marketing firm, created some sort of billboards and that sort of thing.
He kicked it off, yeah. He was... I think that Rolf, for a time, actually held the NFL scoring record. So, scored a lot of points. I think he actually held the NFL record for a while. Anyway, so certainly one way to deal with this is to do what RightCare has done. And I think that story is well told. But if you haven't heard the story, read the handouts, and also you might want to look at the health affairs paper. What I'd like to do is, and so that's a very positive strategy, and we should come back and discuss this. Second strategy is to be more aggressive in diagnosis of treatments. I want to be a little bit nuanced about this. And this is a strategy that I'm not so excited about, but I think there's differences of opinion about it. Again, team is up for discussion. So one of the arguments is, well, we should just put everybody on statins, or we should be much more aggressive in managing blood pressure. One of the things that got me thinking more about this is that I teach each summer in the American Heart Association seminar on the epidemiology and prevention of cardiovascular disease, which is held at Lake Tahoe. It's just a wonderful experience. I've done it for 25 years. We have a former fellow right here. Last summer, someone was supposed to give this lecture on blood pressure management guidelines, and he backed out like not too long before the meeting. And the seminar director called me up and said, no, this is an important lecture, someone's got to give it. And I said, well, I'll do it. You know, did the other person agree to slide? And they said, nothing. So on very short notice, I had an opportunity to sort of get deeper into the guidelines. And I had been doing this a little bit at HRQ because the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force had been working on it. I think it's interesting. So if you take this example, the example is a 48-year-old man with blood pressure of 135 over 87, non-smoker, normal cholesterol, no family history, non-diabetic. So the question is, well, what do the guidelines say about how this person's blood pressure can be managed? Well, it turns out that, now it's changed slightly since then, but the AHA-ACC in 2017 called this stage 1 hypertension. The Europeans called it normal, or high normal. They have a specific category for that. JNC7, the old JNC, called it pre-hypertension. JNC8 called it normal. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force called it normal. And the American College of Physicians and the AAP, the Family Practice Academy, called it healthy. So here we have 6 different guidelines coming to very different conclusions about whether or not this deserves intervention and what the intervention should be. So I found that intriguing. So part of the issue is this, that there are different ways that people look at this. One is what we might call the speed limit rule, that is get below a fixed value and stay there. There's the lower is better hypothesis, that is lower is always better. And then there's the one size fits all. So it doesn't matter if you have, if things differ by age, race, sex, diabetes, and so forth, then whatever the rule is, by a millimeters of mercury, then you should proceed. So part of this, from the public health perspective, goes back to the famous Jeffrey Rose book. And for those of you that are not familiar, everybody that goes to public health school is exposed to this. But Rose argued, I think quite persuasively, that well,
Brian is going to try to get your hand.
There you go. There it is. So what happens is that if you look at the individual level, and this would be systolic blood pressure and MI, and then what happens is, or stroke, I'm sorry. Then what happens is that as you go higher, the probability for an individual of having an event systematically increases. But in fact, most strokes in the community occur from people closer to the center of the distribution. And so the argument that Rose made was that what we need to do is we need to move the whole distribution to the left. Because if we do that, then we'll have significantly fewer strokes. So deal with the population as opposed to individuals. And that's been a mantra in public health for a long time. You know, part of the rationale for this has been the argument that the relationship between something like systolic blood pressure and stroke is linear. And in fact, going back a couple of years, the Prospective Studies Collaborative, about 1 million people in this meta-analysis, shows these lines, and you can see that they look very linear. And so again, the argument is the lower we can go, the better. And in fact, this has motivated a lot of the thinking about lowering blood pressure. But in fact, if you look at what was really done, is actually the y-axis is not in regular units, it's in log units. The relationship is not linear, it's log linear. And if you look at what was done in this group, they actually say in the paper, well, they decided just to ignore the off-diagonal points. So these points here were not used in fitting the line. And so as you get down toward normal, actually, there's not very much benefit.
So Bob, I do this for the sake of everyone. Most people won't ask the question, so I ask it for the group, which is, can you explain what you mean by log linear?
So the y-axis is in logarithmic units, it's not in normal units. So if you look at it, it goes 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. So that it isn't, the units aren't natural units. And in fact, if you regraph it like Mike on and Zion and I did, just getting the same data and then just regraphing it using natural units on the y-axis, what happens is there is a little bit of benefit. This breaks down by age. But actually, the benefit is relatively flat until you get to about 140 millimeters of mercury. This is the traditional threshold for treatment, and then it goes up. It goes up very steeply for older people. And actually, it's going up at this level before that. So it is a little bit more nuanced, and as we get back into the review of new studies, including the SPRINT trial, it is more complicated to interpret. So the argument goes something like this. So if you select different thresholds, you dramatically change the number of people eligible for treatment. So for instance, the JNC8 threshold was about 150 millimeters of mercury for systolic pressure. And that actually, didn't last long, but that came out, and it came out to really a lot of anxiety among people practicing. So if you look at the JNC7, what they call normal, which was for pre-hypertension, there are a lot more people that are included. And so again, all of these variables are relatively normally distributed in the population. So when you move the threshold for treatment to the left, you have a lot more people that you have to attend to. And there have been a bunch of different analyses of this in relation to the JNC8 guidelines. So what happens is, if you look at the new ACA, AHA guidelines, in relation to the JNC8 guidelines, it affects a lot of people. So it labels about 70 million people aged 45 to 75 with hypertension. And it would affect about 63% of the people in that age group. So it has a big effect on the number of people taking medications. The question we might want to come back to in the discussion is, what are the benefits and what are the consequences of doing this? To get there, though, by the way, I won't go into this much detail. It's the same for cholesterol. So when they did the National Cholesterol Education Program guidelines, this was done some years ago, they said the same thing, that, well, this is a linear relationship. But in fact, when you look at this, it's actually a log scale on the y-axis. They're not natural units. So when you really look at the relationship, this is total cholesterol and CHD events, it looks something like this. And the concern is that very aggressive treatment, that is, if you take LDL cholesterol and you say, well, if you've got somebody that's 90, how much benefit do you get from putting them on a PCSK9 inhibitor and getting them down to 30? The answer is maybe a little bit, but not a lot. It's not at all like the benefit you get from taking somebody at the higher end of the continuum and bringing them down. That's good.
So it's interesting that you picked 35 to 57. Is this your analysis?
Pardon?
This is men aged 35 to
Yeah.
57.
Yeah, and this comes from the numbers that you have to be educated for.
Mr. Pitt. Mr. Fett, right, yeah. So, I wanted to just take a minute and